Welcome back to Criminological Theory. What we're going to look at this week is the Chicago School and then cultural and subcultural theories of crime. Again, continuing in our exploration of society. As we do each week, we're going to start with a beginning understanding of study, which is starting off with the School of Ecology or the Chicago School. And basically, this theory was an attempt to generalize a lot of different aspects of the conditions in society to try and understand how we can help improve society by improving very specific conditions in an area while also attempting not to impact the area too much. So what we mean by that is balancing out the positive impacts versus the negative. And that can be a problem in criminological theory and the application of it, especially with policy, which is we can't force society in all areas to do the things that needs to be done to improve. But on top of that, there is some reason to believe, for example, with tricky topics, which we'll see later on, with things like gentrification, if we improve certain areas, are we actually going to be hurting the conditions in that society where it needs help? So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the reason why it's called the Chicago School was the theorists who looked at the school really started to look at Chicago in and of itself. And what you found there was, despite the fact that it was growing so largely, the social agencies were not formal. You can see here, they actually had no social workers. And on top of that, the police were highly corrupt. Don't forget, during Prohibition, most of the police officers were on the take in terms of they protected individuals like Al Capone and his organized crime group. So you had kind of a breakdown right from the start, which you didn't have people who were able to help the poor in society. And then on top of that, the people who were supposed to protect everyone else were heavily embedded with a mobster, that you didn't have equal enforcement of the law. And then when you look at the garbage collectors, they were often considered so just basically not useful for society, despite the fact that collecting the garbage is immensely useful to society, that people actually didn't really want to pursue the job, right? So it also started to cause problems with the decline in the neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. They eventually, though, decided to take back their own problems within the internal communities, and that caused chaos. In the conditions related to, obviously, with Al Capone and the running of weapons and alcohol during Prohibition, what you found there was that people were getting killed. And then on top of that, because so much of the city were people who had never been born in the United States, there was a disconnect between what it meant to be living in a new nation like the United States. Because don't forget, late 1800s, early 1900s, the United States is still relatively new in the time period of history, and what these individuals were bringing from their other cultural groups, what the values and morals and values were, but on top of that, what they considered their adherence to the law to be. So sociologists started to go in and take a look at this and say, can this help us understand this idea of transmission of crime? And why does it occur in certain areas when they're structured the way they are? So Park was one of the first. Basically, you looked at city growth and this idea of evolution of city growth. And what you found was residential neighborhoods started to get impacted in Chicago by the businesses. And that actually, in some measure, had a negative impact in those traditional residential neighborhoods, because not only were they disrupting the people who lived in those neighborhoods and their ability to build a cohesiveness as one group, so establish their own cultural values, but on top of that, the businesses were creating greater opportunity for, unfortunately, involvement in crime, right? Whether it's just individuals going in and breaking into the businesses, or, for example, during the rise of Prohibition, the businesses being used as fronts for criminal activity. So what you found was Park started to notice that basically it was a measure of the environment, of just ecology, that much like plants or a tree where it has its roots, a city will continue to grow and some invasive aspects or areas will invade or dominate each other, and that can include either the businesses or even the areas in and of themselves. And then that creates a recipe for the transmission of crime, basically. So what they looked at was concentric. Down first, as you see here, by was there a business district present, a zone in transition, or the working class? They then looked at the residential and the commuters. And particularly what Shaw and McKay found was that each of these neighborhoods had more crime than the others. And particularly some of the commuter zones, we've gone back to these concentric zones, what Shaw and McKay found was that there was basically this transmission, cultural transmission of criminal values that occurred in the commuter zone by people who were basically coming in. They were the others, the outsiders, the invaders. In the residential areas, when they started to get impacted by the businesses moving in outside of the business district, you started to see disruption of criminal behavior and some decline. In the working class zone, they were very angry, the working class individuals, by the zone in transition people. They didn't want to deal with the individuals who were fleeing an area that had completely fallen apart or was transiting either from business to residential, from residential to business. They didn't want to deal with it. But each of them they found had three common problems. And you see them here. The biggest one is the same problem we see in modern American cities today, that the physical areas started to fall apart. Each of them also had varying levels of poverty. And also, too, when we talk about heterogeneity, how did they blend each of these different groups together into basically getting along with each other? So whether it's Chicago, New York, or Los Angeles, they all grew the same way. They all had these different zones, which again, if you go back to them, it's a business district, a zone in transition, working class, residential, and commuter. So then what Sean McKay argued was that in essence, each of these American cities, much like a tree with its roots growing, or just any other type of ecological environment, there was a natural outgrowth and they all popped up the same way. So then they had similar problems. And particularly, what they looked at there was invasive species, right? So the buffalo here, picture here in the textbook, that was a foreign element that created chaos. Well, crime does that in residential areas and crime does that in cities. It becomes an invasive species. So building out from Sean McKay, Ferracuti and Wolfgang looked at this and said, what starts to develop then is a mixture of cultural and subcultural values. That we start to teach each other the transmission of crime, and we become to understand it as our learned way of dealing with life. Miller built on Ferracuti and Wolfgang and said that the lower class in and of itself started to create a cultural value system with 6 focal concerns. And each of them had some aspect with how you're supposed to survive in the lower class. Many individuals in the lower class felt like they were basically stuck with the way things were. That if they lived a long life, or if they died young, if they died from violence or died poor, that they were fated to do so. No concept of basically responsibility of oneself, that it was always going to happen. They had some problems with autonomy. They didn't feel like they were basically able to take responsibility for oneself. So what you found was these individuals within these lower class groups had trouble with growth, right? And particularly they looked at it from adolescence in and of themselves. Again, this is the individuals who are looking at it as young kids, right? These people, some kids particularly didn't like to be controlled, right? They wanted to be autonomous. Many kids sought out excitement, that they searched for thrills or danger or risk. Some kids needed to depend on street smarts. They needed to be able to con other children. Other kids needed to be physically tough. They needed to be a man, right? So in each of these, what eventually happens is that trouble develops as well. So while he looked at juveniles, it did have some play with everyone else because this became something that was ingrained in your way of thinking, of behavior. So eventually, Anderson developed the code of the street to state that when you live in a city, you start to abide yourself by these informal rules. And at the very heart, it was respect. So basically, you structured your family in these environments on this idea of either earning respect, and that could include, like Miller talked about, being tough or conning or outsmarting people, or by basically retreating away and not really trying to enforce change. He also talked about this idea of decent families, that some families maintained mainstream values and they were heavily involved in their church and people were polite, cooperative, and oftentimes they were poor, or others were the street. They were superficial and they were aggressive, and the kids had to learn how to be tough. So, in each of these measures of the ecological Chicago school, it was looking at one unique environment in American culture and saying, this is why it's struggling with crime. And this is why crime is transmitted through these zones, right? Or through these issues related to American society. And in each of them, it's this idea that basically we can structure ourselves on some measure by understanding the nature of what it's like to live in an American city and have to come up either on the street or as a decent family. So the policy implications were clear cut from the Chicago school. In Chicago, they focused on getting kids, particularly off the streets during times on the weekends or even during the week if the kids didn't go to school. Unfortunately, if the parents weren't making sure they were going to school, but providing things like youth athletic leagues or midnight basketball. They built a ton of community organizations to try and combat gang activity. As a matter of fact, not just the Peace Builders, but also a group called the Interrupters, which has its own PBS Frontline documentary that I'll encourage you to watch on your own time, really try to stop and continue to stop gang activity in the city of Chicago. And many American cities developed more neighborhood watch groups that try to encourage these individuals within these neighborhoods to, in essence, take back their streets. I hope this was helpful for you for understanding these theories, and thank you for your time.